Hello, my name is John Mark Johnson Jr. I am the host of Reform GGA, and today we're going to talk about field stripping the CX4 Storm Rifle by Beretta. This gun is fortunately not too terribly difficult to field strip. It does have a few little quirks that we'll talk about, but for the most part, it's fairly straightforward. As with any gun, when you go to field strip it, first thing you want to do is clear it, and the magazine release on this gun is basically where you would expect it to be on a conventional semi-auto handgun. So when we at the juncture of the grip and the trigger guard is where the magazine release is. We'll just go ahead and push that, which will release the magazine. And then we of course need to clear the chamber, and the way that we do that is by pulling back on the charging handle, and any rounds will pop out of the ejection port, of course. I'm going to place my hand there just to catch the round when it pops out. And there is the round that was in the chamber. This is just a snap cap for demonstration purposes. And now we are ready to begin the disassembly. But I will note that before you begin the disassembly, even if you've already checked and cleared the gun beforehand and all that, there is still another couple of safety considerations. Well, not so much safety as it is just practical, can you get the gun apart type of thing. And that is making sure that the hammer is locked back. So during clearing of the weapon, you usually will pull back on the charging handle like I showed you, and that will lock down the hammer. So as long as you've run the action, the hammer will be down and you can disassemble it. If you try to disassemble it while the hammer is up, that will not work overly well, just saying. So yeah, make sure that the hammer is down, and also make sure that the bolt is forward. The easy way to check that is wherever the charging handle is, because you can actually have the charging handle on the other side too. You can swap it. Most of the things on the gun are swappable. But look at the charging handle, and if it is in the forward position and it slots all the way forward in its slot, it is a reciprocating charging handle. It moves back and forth with the bolt. So if the charging handle is forward, that means that the bolt is forward. What you don't want is something that would look like that. So if the ejection port is open, or if the charging handle is in the rear position, that will not work for disassembly either. So make sure that the bolt is forward, make sure that the gun has been charged so that the hammer is down. Like I already said, make sure that it's clear first. Once you've done all that, then you can begin disassembly. There's only one takedown pin, fortunately, and it's actually this little teardrop shaped thing right there. I'm going to go ahead and push from the other side. You can it doesn't matter which side you push from. I'm going to push from the other side so that you can see it come out here. Okay, there we go. So there is the takedown cross pin, and that will allow us to separate the upper and the lower. They slide out from each other, and I'm going to be kind of careful about it, just because I don't want it to come apart too drastically. There we go. So the upper and the lower slide apart. Go ahead and do that. The upper I'm just going to set aside for the moment, and we'll talk very briefly about the lower. The lower, for the most part, is like a conventional semi-auto handgun in terms of a lot of the bits and pieces that you would expect to find there. Now there is a little bit of a difference in that the safety is a cross-bolt safety, so that's going to be a little bit different, but not too big of a thing. And then another thing that is different just about the gun design in general is the design of the hammer. Now I'm going to go ahead and take it off safe, hold the hammer down and pull the trigger, and then slowly release the hammer. That's how you get behind the hammer to clean underneath and all that kind of stuff. But the reason why I'm taking it out and showing you guys this hammer is because I wanted you to notice what it is made of. That hammer is actually made of polymer. It's plastic. As to this is a hammer that really makes me ask why, because there's no particular reason why plastic would be advantageous over what hammers are usually made out of, which is usually steel. There's no great benefit to having a polymer hammer in there. I mean, there are a few benefits that you can cite. One of them would be a little bit lower cost, although a steel hammer is not all that expensive to produce, but a little bit lower cost, you could possibly state. Also has less problems with chatter marks on the bolt, things like that. It's also going to be less sensitive to bolt bounce and those kinds of things, or hammer bounce in this case. So okay, I take that back. There are some advantages as to why somebody would want to go with a polymer hammer, but it is kind of a weird design choice. That being said, I have not seen any reports that would confirm that the polymer hammer is in some way defective, that it leads to malfunctions later on or anything like that. Now, in terms of track record, this little polymer hammer actually does just fine. These guns, the Beretta CX4 Storm rifles in general, actually have a very good reliability record, despite having a polymer plastic hammer. So it is a weirdness, and like I said, there are a few advantages to it, but it's not really necessary. There are other ways to take care of a lot of those problems that most other guns do just fine with their steel hammers. So it is weird, but even though it is weird, it doesn't actually produce any real world problems. So you might get into the gun and you might be surprised to find that it has a polymer hammer, but don't be. It's actually not that big of a deal. And then to make it ready to, after you've cleaned behind the hammer and all that, to make it ready to go ahead and put back together, you want to always press that hammer down. Make sure that you get the click. And then once you get the click, we can go ahead and put it back on safety. It actually doesn't matter with this gun where you do the safety in the process, but whenever the hammer is down, I like to have the safety on, just so that if I accidentally press the trigger, I'm not dropping it without there being something to resist it. You should either have it in the gun to do that, or you should have your fingers on it holding it down whenever you release it, because otherwise it'll flip up with a little bit too much force and it can cause problems like any hammer would. But yeah, a little bit weird that it's a polymer hammer, but actually doesn't affect a whole lot. Another thing that people might find interesting is that the back of the lower receiver here is actually solid. The bolt cannot go any further back than where my finger is right now, meaning that the rest of the stock here is just that. It is just the stock. There's no buffer tube in here or anything like that. There's no action that goes on back there. It's just stock. That's all that it is. Very hollow, light stock. With it being hollow, I kind of would have wished that they would have put in a trap door for, like a cleaning kit or something like that, but no. It's a solid back end, so there's no cleaning kit or anything that you can put back there, sadly. And I know why Beretta used this particular design, the thumb hole stock design, and that's because it's easier to import into a fairly wide variety of countries that way, including the US. So they did it for legal reasons, but they didn't do it for mechanical reasons. Mechanically, all the action stops basically at this point, which means that after that you could have done pretty much whatever you wanted just in terms of mechanics. You could have made this into a telescoping stock, you could have made it into a folding stock, you could have done a lot of things with it, but we don't get any of those cool benefits of having the short action because legal reasons. They wanted to be able to import it as is, and so they had to choose a stock style that frankly was not particularly interesting and did not make use of the short action. Alright, so beat that horse to death. We'll go ahead and set that aside. Like I said, there's not a whole lot there that isn't fairly familiar, if you're familiar with semi-auto handguns, that is. As to the upper, it's a little bit more of a chore. The first thing that we're going to do is pull back on the charging handle, and then we're going to try to take that charging handle out. So I've already pulled back, that is exposed the recoil spring back here, and I'm going to try to take it out. And a lot of times, if you go to take it out after immediately pulling it back, you can't get it out. Now what we're trying to do is make the hole in the bolt line up with this little semicircular cut in the receiver, and if they're lined up perfectly, then the charging handle should be able to come out. There's that goes on both sides. There's the charging handle hole and the hole in the receiver and in the bolt that you need to line up. You can do it on either side, but yeah, like I said, if you just pull back all the way, it usually doesn't line up quite right. So I'm going to readjust here just a little bit. Nope, that's still not quite right, and sometimes you have to readjust quite a little bit, and you can go back and forth for a while on it. And once you get it in the right place, it should come out pretty easily. If it's not coming out easily, it's because you don't have it lined up just perfectly like it likes to be. There we go. So, finally got it to come out with just a little bit of finger pressure, and you can see some material that's built up on either side of the metal crosspiece there that holds it in place normally. And normally the charging handle could not get back that far because the lower receiver gets in the way of that, and it doesn't let it come back that last little bit of distance to get into that semicircle cut. But once you get the charging handle out, then you can go ahead and pull the bolts out of the rear of the upper receiver. And this bolt is a curiosity in and of itself. It is a very interesting design. This is a telescoping bolt, like maxed out to the very max. Definitely had some design inspiration from the Israeli Uzi going on. The Israeli Uzi is another subgun that makes use of a telescoping bolt. And for those of you who don't know what makes it telescoping, it is the fact that the bolt face is actually way back here. That's where the bolt face is, and of course the bolt extends way past its bolt face in the forward direction. And what that does is it saves space on the back end. On a conventional blowback bolt, you would have the breech face, and then the rest of the mast that you see out in front would actually be behind everything, and so you'd need a fairly long receiver. Like I showed you guys, even though the receiver itself is fairly big, the action distance is just right here where I'm gripping it. It only goes back that far. And that is because they basically moved where the bolt was. Instead of behind the breech face, most of the bolt is in front of it. You don't take as much room on the back side. So you can shorten everything up back there, and you can put in a telescoping stock or a folding stock or something like that, except they couldn't do that because of legal reasons. But normally, when groups do that, that's because they're trying to get more space on the back side. Now, there is still an advantage to having a telescoping bolt, even if you don't make use of the short receiver that it gives you. And that main advantage is that it minimizes barrel flip. With a lot of blowback guns that would be more conventionally laid out with the bolts behind the breech face, the center of mass will wind up moving behind your hand that is your primary hand that is the pivot point for the gun. And if the main mass of the gun moves behind your hand, it's going to cause your hand to rotate usually, and of course the barrel rises up, and that makes the gun less controllable, especially if it is, a military gun that is select fire and you've put it into full auto. You don't want a gun that climbs too much. Well, a telescoping bolts, because all the mass is forward and it stays forward even when the gun is reciprocating, the center of mass will still be forward of the pivot hand, and as long as that mass stays forward, you're not going to get a whole lot of muzzle rise. Now the trade-off from that is that even though you don't get much muzzle rise, the gun will tend to bounce around a little bit more. So instead of consistent upward movement, it'll kind of start bouncing in kind of circles or figure eights, depending on the firing rate, depending on how you're holding it, etc., etc. But at least it's not, climbing into anti-aircraft territory. So telescoping bolts is very interesting that way. The barrel actually fits inside of the bolt, and it's surrounded by the bolt on all sides. And this means that you actually have to cut access ports into the bolt to do fairly normal things. So on the bottom there is a fairly large port here so that it can interface with the magazine. So this is where the rounds get fed into the barrel, and all that is on the bottom side, and so that area is cut out for that. And then on either side we have ejection port cutouts. On the left-hand side here, you'll notice that there's a little plastic piece that is in the way, but that can be taken out if you want to change how it ejects. And then the right-hand side is left open so that you can get rounds out that side. So there is ejection ports in the bolt itself, and of course there are the normal ejection port holes in the upper receiver. So it has basically two sets of ejection ports, which is kind of an odd thing, but given the design, that's kind of necessitated. I will go ahead and warn you ahead of time that if you're just doing a simple field strip, it's not a good idea to mess with the main recoil spring. If you start messing with the main recoil spring, you can actually wind up disassembling certain parts in here that you don't want to disassemble. I will go ahead and show that to you guys just so you know what's happening and how to fix it. But if you try to get the recoil spring out, you basically just push down, and that'll pop the end out. And then if you want to get the whole thing off, basically just keep twisting, and you'll see this little clasp plate in the rear that you actually wind up moving up, and you can take it actually completely off the bolt. Now, I wouldn't recommend that you do this as a part of normal cleaning, although obviously you can, and I just did. But the reason why I would suggest that you not do that is because it leaves the extractor loose on one side. Let's see if I can get it to move for you. So yeah, that is the extractor piece right there. And without that little clip in place, it's free to get lost, basically. And so that's not a good idea. And then the ejector, whoops, like I said, if you don't have the clasp in place, things are going to move and fall out. And then on the other side, you'll notice this other little spring here, and that is actually attached to the ejector. And yeah, if you don't have that clasp in place, you can wind up losing your ejector and extractor, and that's not a good thing. But to put it back together is fairly simple. Take your recoil spring, lock it into its little notch in the front there, just push it down, and then take your retaining clip, make sure that it is properly oriented, and just push that down until it snaps in place. And I snapped it in place too soon. Wound up with the ejector on the wrong side. No, that was the extractor, sorry. Alright, taking it back off, re-putting it back on. This is why I said don't do that, because it takes forever and you get a bunch of little pieces to mess with, and it's not so nice. Come on. Wrong side, that'll do it. There we go. Okay. Alright, both of those pieces are in. Again, go ahead and put in the spring. Take the clip, properly oriented. Just snap it down into place. Alright. So that's good. That's good. Alright. Now, I will go ahead and say that the ejector is actually kind of interesting because it's spring-loaded. But it doesn't act like a spring-loaded ejector normally does. When people think of spring-loaded ejectors, they're usually thinking of things like the AR-15's spring-loaded ejector. This one actually is spring-loaded so that it actually stays consistent with the receiver. It locks into the receiver basically and moves with it. So it actually acts just as if it was a fixed ejector that most blowback guns have. So it acts like a fixed ejector, but it is clearly a spring-loaded one. Kind of a weird little bit of engineering there. And then, of course, inside you have the bolt face, and of course, because it's inside of this relatively thin bolt, it's a little hard to gain access to. You'll definitely need a small brush and some small swabs to get in there and clean that out, but it is in there. And then going to the back side of the bolt, you can see this other little piece that moves in. That is the drop safety. And you will not actually find that on all subguns. Not all subguns have a drop safety in them, especially depending on their age. This one is a recent enough design that that was definitely included, which is a good thing without that piece being depressed. What is that called? The firing pin. The little firing pin, the little bit of silver that you see on there, is if that safety isn't pushed in, that firing pin cannot protrude all the way out of the bolt face like it's supposed to, and it keeps the gun from firing when it's not supposed to. You know, if you drop it, that's why it's called a drop safe. Alright, so there is those considerations. Like I said, you've got a lot going on inside because you're fitting the bolts around the barrel, and so your extractor and ejector and all that actually operate inside of the bolts, and it kicks rounds out through a hole in the bolt. So everything's going on inside. You'll need little brushes and swabs to get in there. And then it does have rails, as you can see, these big long rails that go the whole length of the bolts on either side. So fairly conventional in that regard. A lot of subguns have railed bolts, so that's normal. And in terms of cleaning and lubricating them, you do it just like on any handgun that happens to have rails. So clean it out, put a few drops of lube in that channel on both sides, so like 4 to 6 drops of lube to make sure that the channel is nice and lubricated so that the bolt moves freely. And that's pretty much the end of the considerations there. It's weird because everything is on the inside of the bolt instead of on the outside, basically like most conventional bolts. But that being aside, it does what bolts usually do. Alright, so that is that. And then we can talk about the upper. The upper is interesting because the barrel is basically just floating in the back end of the upper. It's actually only attached at the front. That's where basically the front trunnion is. That's how the bolt is attached to the upper, is over on this side. The little plate that you see here, which is where they put the serial number, because in America all the serialized parts have to be done in metal, so there's a little metal plate here, and that metal plate basically makes contact with the front trunnion, and that front trunnion, of course, is what holds in the barrel in place. But like I said, the back end of the barrel, it is just floating in space out there. And because of that, it doesn't have a conventional feed ramp. It does have a little bit of a feed ramp that you can see at the top, that little protrusion up there. But there's no bottom feed ramp like you get on most guns. Most handguns, as well as most blowback semi-autos, all have a lower feed ramp. Instead, this one has just a very small upper feed ramp, which is very unconventional, but it has an unconventional bolt, and so that's why they can get away with that. And it actually works quite well and tends to be quite reliable. So kind of a weird way to do it, but it works. But aside from the barrel, the front end is basically hollow, except if you look down in there, you'll see one little piece at the lower end that just kind of sticks out there in space again, and that is just the piece that is there to hold a light if you happen to want to put a weapon light on there. Just a little bit of extra pick rail with a notch so you can put a weapon light on the gun. And I'm taking that in and out just by pushing on the sling swivel here. It's spring loaded. So push that back in, slide it back down, we're good to go. Whoops. And I slid that just a little bit too far. I'm used to it being in the gun proper. And well, that was dumb on my part. Okay. Sorry, there are weird things with the gun that can go wrong. What just happened is that in pushing in the spring swivel, I pushed a little bit too far, and now that little holder that I showed you for the weapon light went way too far, and now I've got to try to get it back. There we go. Yeah, it doesn't need to be quite that far in there. Okay, there we go. It should be resting just so that there's that little thumb groove there. That's where it should rest. Yeah, there's lots of weird things that can go wrong when you disassemble it, and I'm disassembling it obviously much more than it needs to be disassembled, so you guys know why not to. So don't take off the clip off the bolts, and when the gun is disassembled, be very careful about hitting that sling swivel because it releases weird things. Alright, in terms of getting the gun back together, that is fairly straightforward. Take the bolts and slide it onto the rails that you see on either side of the upper there. Alright, so yeah, right where my fingers run along, that's the rail. So you're going to match up the rails on the bolts with those, and then it should slide in pretty well after that. I'm trying And then as you're sliding it in, keep sliding it until the little ring in the bolt matches up with the ring in the receiver, so you can put your charging handle back in. And if you've got it lined up perfectly like it likes to be lined up, it should go in pretty easily. If not, you usually can just get it back in by wiggling it back and forth a little bit. And then you should be able to push forward on the charging handle and get it the rest of the way in. If it locks up for whatever reason, like it has here, sometimes it's because that little clip that I showed you on the back of the bolt has come out a little bit. There we go. And you can usually kind of wiggle that around. Sometimes you have to take the bolt back out and snap back down that clip. But that is that. And then align the outer portions of the upper receiver and the lower receiver. Don't worry about the long triangular front end. Just worry about the outer portions. Get those lined up. And then it should slide together pretty easily. Push it together. And then you should be able to just push the little pin through. I'm going to go ahead and show you guys from the other side. Yep. And it is back together. Try to make sure that's fairly flush on each side. And there you go. So that is how you field strip and reassemble a CX4 Storm. Do not take the clip off of the back of the bolts, because then you release the extractor and ejector and those will go weird places. Be careful about the front sling swivel when the gun is taken apart, because if you push too far on the too hard on the light mounts, it can actually wind up going into the upper receiver much more than it is supposed to, and as you saw, the sling swivel can pop out and go missing and things like that. Normally when you disassemble and reassemble it, all that you need to do is do the pin, upper to lower, bolt, charging handle, and bolts. So there's like 5 pieces normally. If you do it wrong enough though, that clip comes out off of the bolts and the front sling swivel pin comes out, and then you have more to deal with. Alright, so I beat that horse to death, made it look utterly complicated because there are some complicated parts, but now you know. Alright, thank you everyone for your time and attention. For those of you who are in Christ, go with God and be blessed. For those of you who are not, I pray that you would come to know the true Christ of history, the only genuine Savior and King of Kings. Amen.